Welcome to Small Change. I'm your host, Doreen Nickel, and today I'm joined by Mike Balquill, Vice President of Campaigns and Engagement for Small Change Fund, and also Campaign Director for Reform Gravel Mining Coalition. I'm really glad to have you here today to talk about the unprecedented and largely unregulated expansion of gravel mining in Ontario, Mike.
Hi, Doreen. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So let's start with an overview of gravel mining in Ontario. Currently, about 165 million metric tons of aggregate is produced every year. Yet under the Ford government, province has authorized annual extraction limits 13 times the amount of gravel used annually in Ontario, and it continues issuing new licenses that consume approximately 5,000 acres of land annually. For listeners, that's about 7,000 football fields every year. In fact, provincial policy around land management use states, and I quote, "There is no need to show need for a new pit or quarry. As much gravel shall be made available as possible, and no discussion of whether it's needed or not shall be allowed." The industry is also licensed to take up to 4.6 billion liters of water daily for extraction processes. And as if that's not enough, in 2023, the Ontario Auditor General report showed the industry is not managed adequately and that we can expect violations that are likely to be unpublished by the Ford government. Mike, none of this really makes any sense, particularly when we're in the middle of a climate crisis and water in some communities is under threat from drought and corporate extraction for bottling. Why is the Ford government refusing to create and enforce aggregate regulations that reflect sound ecological practices?
It really is a crime, I think. I think the Ford government's environmental policies are a climate crime. You know, in your question about why they're refusing to create and enforce aggregate regulations, I mean, that's a broad question that you can ask about all Ford's policies. The Ford government puts extraction of natural resources and all development ahead of all environmental concerns. You know, you read the statement about no need and no discussion would be allowed. And while that's specific to aggregate, in a way, in the broadest sense, the Ford government is saying there's no need to think about the environment and discussion of the environment will not be allowed. And you know this more better than I do, and you've covered it in other podcasts, but they're dismantling every guardrail around the environment. What is really green protections or green guardrails, they're calling red tape. If you think of construction sites, etc., these boundaries are there to protect people and to protect us from harm. And under the Ford government, everything in the environment is available for consumption. I mean, they're in complete denial of how nature works. They believe wetlands and habitat can simply be moved to another spot. And that's not the case. And it's this type of thinking that's actually responsible for the climate crisis. You know, Hemingway, the author, when he was asked, how did you go bankrupt? He is supposed to have said two ways, gradually, then suddenly. If you're gradually going bankrupt, it's important to stop unnecessary spending and take stock of your resources. And the climate crisis is the gradual, headed for the sudden bankrupting of all of our ecological resources. And managing resources means assessing supply and defining need. If you don't define need, then it's unrelenting demand, which is unsustainable.
That's so true, Mike. And Mike, we're often told that gravel mining creates good jobs and gravel's needed for building. That's the go-to. What we aren't told is that a single-family homeowner often pays more in property taxes than a 100-acre commercial gravel mine. In fact, right now, there's several municipalities locked in appeals with the gravel industry over property taxes. How is this equitable when the mine is increasing truck traffic on local roads? It's affecting air quality, generating noise, posing threats to groundwater, as well as generating vibrations that shake and damage homes.
Nothing about gravel mining is equitable, Doreen. Nothing about the process of it, nothing about the decision-making process, starting with the property taxes and the levies the industry pays, all the way up to the risks that are put on the public. I think the implication of your question, in a way, it's a good question, but the implication is, why aren't they behaving in a better way. And I think it's important to realize it's not a bug that they're not being equitable, it's a feature. It's designed to be inequitable. It's designed to put all of the risks onto the public and let the private sector take the profits. And you see this whether it comes to pit rehabilitation or whether it comes to the criteria for making decisions. I want to dwell on this business of equity for a second this way, and I want to use an analogy if I can. When they make a decision about a gravel pit application or gravel mine application, they look at the very specific site and its impacts on the very immediate area. There's no consideration of what we might call cumulative impacts. Now, I want you to imagine going to the doctor and you have wounds on different parts of your body. And the doctor says, I'm going to evaluate each wound separately. And I'm just going to look at its impact on that immediate part of your body, on your foot or on your leg or on your arm or on your scalp. And I'm not going to look at the impact of that wound on your whole body or the impact of all of the wounds on your whole body. If you went to a doctor like that, you'd think they were a complete quack. You would think they wouldn't be caring for you at all. But that's how it is with gravel mining. The evaluation is always limited to a very narrow area. I'm going to give you two quick examples. In Caledon, excuse me, near the Forks of the Credit, there are existing right now a dozen pits that cover 3,000 acres, which viewed from above is one giant moonscape on the just east of the Credit River. Now, Votorantim, which also is known as CBM in St. Mary's, want to blast a new 700-acre quarry on the west side of the river. There's no requirement to evaluate the cumulative impact of that new quarry on the Credit River or its contribution to the collective airshed. So dust is coming off those 3,000 acres that are a pit, a mine, a huge gravel mine now, and there's going to be dust coming off of the Votorantim, but there's no cumulative assessment of the contribution to the airshed. That's not a responsible way. That's not an equitable way. That's not taking into full consideration the impacts of gravel mining in Ontario.
I'd like to focus for a moment on the Hallman Pit in Wilmot Township, which is part of Waterloo Region. 4 years ago, City Council unanimously voted to deny Jackson Harvest Farms a rezoning application that would allow 57 hectares or 150 acres of prime farmland to be used for aggregate extraction, as well as asphalt recycling, concrete recycling, and 5 waste ponds. The site threatens a regional groundwater recharge area, as well as municipal wellhead protected area and protected countryside and a significant wetland. No fewer than 7 open pit mines are located directly across from the proposed pit. Currently, those 7 pits are extracting at only 10% of their licensed capacity. So there's really no need for another pit at all. However, the owners of Jackson Harvest Farms appealed council's decision to the Ontario Land Tribunal. The tribunal held a 7-day hearing. Wilmot City Council did not defend its position at the OLT. Instead, Citizens for Safe Groundwater, a nonprofit organization protecting the Waterloo Moraines groundwater from industrial aggregate activity, opposed the license that would permit the operation of an above water table pit. Citizens for Safe Groundwater argued against licensing the pit based on the impacts to air quality and health, noise, transportation, as well as a lack of consistency with provincial policy statement and the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. Unfortunately, on February 21st, 2024, the adjudicator ruled in favor of Jackson Harvest Farms, and it's my understanding there's no appeal process for an OLT decision. Mike, you see this as a failure of the Ford government, the municipal government, and the Ontario Land Tribunal process to protect Ontarians. Could you explain to listeners why we were failed and how the Wilmot community will continue to fight to save this important farmland and the surrounding environment?
Well, I want to give you some good news first, Doreen. The community the Citizens for Safe Groundwater and their council have filed for a judicial review of the OLT decision. Now that judicial review has to be granted, but they've taken that step, and so it's not over yet. The fight's not over yet. And we wish them well and will be supportive of everything they do. Again, the failure is a systemic bias in favor of the industry. The Ontario Land Tribunal is like giving developers, gravel mining companies, another turn at bat after they strike out. So they struck out. The Wilmot Council said no last spring, a year ago, for very good reasons. There are very serious concerns about this application. And as the point you made is, there's absolutely no need for it. Ontario does not need that pit. Rick Esbaugh, the owner of Jackson Harvest Farms, may need it. He may need that for his business, but there's no need for that additional pit in terms of meeting Ontario's requirement for aggregate. Now, municipalities have the responsibility to determine if a development fits with their official plan. And if they say no, that should be it. Developers should, they make their case, and if they lose, they lose. If the council votes no, they should stand by that. And when gravel companies and developers appeal, the municipality, especially rural ones, really feel they don't have the financial resources or the expertise to go to the OLT and win. And the track record at the OLT is very high for developers. You have to remember the council did vote against this initially, but when they look at the appeal, they understand that the odds of them winning are low, they're risk averse. They should defend their communities. The residents of Wilmot were entitled to support from their council. I don't think their council failed them so much as their council were cowards. I understand their risk averseness, but they were cowards. They could have defended the community. And personally, I think appeal to the OLT is a misnomer. The adjudicators aren't judges. They're not using case law or precedent to make decisions. They can simply prefer the evidence of one expert over another. For a variety of reasons, they choose to prefer the experts of the proponent. The other thing about OLT appeals, the people think of appeals and tribunals maybe as going in front of a judge and you make your case and the judge makes a decision. Ontario Land Tribunal hearings are really like workshops where the proponent gets to improve their application. If the residents group says this is a real problem, and the adjudicator, I'm oversimplifying this, but the adjudicator turns to the proponent and says, well, can you mitigate that concern? And the proponent, the company says, yeah, we could do that. Then the adjudicator often says, well, then I'll let this application go ahead because the proponent has said they can mitigate that concern. It's not really about a risk analysis and is it too risky or not. It's not really a judgment in any way that people are familiar with judges and judicial hearings. These really are workshops for the applicant to improve their application. The other thing is adjudicators are political appointees. We can debate the merits or the criteria that each government uses to appoint their adjudicators. As we've seen with Ford's comments on his preferences to actually pick judges who agree with him, it's fair to wonder whether his government is appointing adjudicators to the Ontario Land Tribunal who favor extraction. Now, the other part of your question that you ask is, how can Wilmot continue their fight? And I think something that's important to describe, and I've been involved with many, many of these campaigns, I still continue to be involved with them, that focusing on something very specific, like a gravel mining application, raises awareness of people in the community, and they become eyes wide open to what's going on. You've asked many times, is this equitable? And I think you're really asking, Doreen, is this fair? Is this just? And what really becomes evident to people as they participate in these things is it's not just. These things are designed to serve the private interests of aggregate companies, not to serve the public interest. And it actually draws many people into recommitting to activities to protect the environment and to take on larger fights. And there are other things going on in Wilmot Township, and that these campaigns mobilize people to participate in.
Mike, I'd like to take a look at these quarries and pits once they've been exhausted. They are supposed to be rehabilitated, but for the most part, these are multinational corporations and they're foreign owned, and they conduct business without regulations. The aggregate industry knew that Ford would give them whatever they wanted, including rolling back endangered species protection and removing municipal input. None of that bodes well when talking about rehabilitation. because really destroyed farmland can never be restored. And rehabilitation can take hundreds of years, which means it's multi-generational. And who's going to be around to make sure it gets carried out? The costs associated with rehabilitation are vague at best, and often the community, not the quarry owners and operators, actually fund the rehabilitation. So Ontarians are expected to sacrifice prime farmland that feeds their local communities, as well as natural resources that are really part of the social commons. And then they get to foot the bill for the cleanup and restoration afterward. How is any of this in the public interest or even remotely fiscally sound governance on the part of the Ford government?
Well, I guess the theme of today's podcast, Doreen, is it's not fair, it's not equitable, it's not acting in the public interest. You made a comment early in this moment here about the industry not being regulated. I don't think it's fair to say the industry is not regulated. It's more accurate, as the Auditor General has just released in their report, that the regulations are not being enforced. This government is not enforcing the regulations. They're getting away with violations. You know, you get a parking ticket, somebody's going to make you pay that parking ticket. They're not going to let you renew your license until you pay your parking ticket. And yet, the Auditor General found that there are hundreds of approval holders who owe the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forests hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid annual aggregate extraction fees. I mean, you couldn't get away with that. And the Auditor General's report that came out in December on the management of aggregate extraction really was very critical to say that regulations are not being enforced, that there are all kinds of outstanding violations, that low fees incentivize the environmentally destructive mining of virgin, quote unquote, aggregates rather than encouraging the use of recycled aggregate, that pits and quarries amounting to a land area the size of Brampton have sat dormant for 10 or more years with zero rehabilitation efforts. I mean, that's more compelling, I think, than football fields. There are no processes in place to ensure that pits and quarries are rehabilitated, nor to ensure that the rehabilitation does place is effective. You rightly point out that generations of people can live next to a pit or quarry before it's rehabilitated. I think of the Nelson Aggregate Quarry on Mount Nemo, which has been in operation for 100 years.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, generations of people come and go, generations of managers come and go, but that company continues to extract profits. That's really what this is all about.
Mike, in 2022, Reform Gravel Mining Coalition launched the DAM campaign, and I love saying that. Please go and sign the DAM campaign petition. That's Demand a Moratorium Now. Tell small change listeners why it's important for the Ford government to place a moratorium on issuing new gravel mining licenses, like the one that will be issued in Wilmot, and bring us up to date on how the campaign is going. Could you also tell us about other creative strategies that you're launching in your David and Davida versus Goliath fight to protect lives and the environment from gravel mining?
Well, Doreen, I want to come back to my bankruptcy story to talk a metaphor to talk about why we need a moratorium. If you're taking more than you need, and gravel is a non-renewable resource, if you're taking more than you need, if you're gradually going bankrupt, don't you need to stop and take stock? Now, this may sound odd, but bear with me. If you're in the fishing business, the government manages fishing stocks. Maybe they don't manage them well, but they study how many fish are there, how big's the fish population, what's its regeneration rate, how much fish can you take without threatening future supply. The same thing is true of forests and logging. And again, we could argue that the decisions that the government makes aren't completely the ones that we would like or we would prefer, but they do a scientific study. How big is the forest? What's its regeneration rate? How long would it take to grow back? How much can you take and not take? There's no similar activity that's done for gravel. It's simply take as much as you can. Doreen, if you went out tomorrow and bought a 50-acre site of rural land and you wanted to apply for a gravel pit or quarry, you could do that. And there are people who do that and then essentially act as a middle person with an existing company. There's no need to prove need. That's crazy making. And just to come back, just to your numbers you've used, and I hope I can say this in a simple enough way for the audience, because I don't want us to get too weedy. This is not about your audience, it's about not boring them. But the amount of aggregate gravel, sand, and stone that's been extracted for the last 20 years is on average 160 million tons. The industry says they need 4 billion tons for the next 25 years. Well, surprise, surprise, that's 160 million tons a year. So for a 45-year period, the past 20 and the next 25, that's a constant demand, 160. Now, 13 times that amount, 2 billion tons, is licensed for extraction every year. There is excess supply in the stream. We could afford to stop for a while, take stock, and by the way, implement recommendations like the one the Auditor General's made, and make some real definition of how much do we need, where do we need it from. Somebody makes the argument, I think the National Farmers Union makes this argument. The industry likes to talk about how you need to have pits close to market, close to where the project is. And they say that it needs to be close in order to minimize the cost of transportation. But the costs of transportation are transferable. The cost of turning farmland into a gravel pit is a permanent loss. It can't be returned to what it was. We are permanently losing farmland. We are permanently losing the resource that cleans groundwater so we can drink it. That's a permanent loss. What do we want to do? The industry has never fundamentally addressed the question of need. They want to distract us with questions of close to market competition, etc. Are those concerns we should think about? Yes, but are they the fundamental issue of whether we need to license all of these new pits and quarries? No. And so the moratorium is a pause to say, let's stop and take stock of this non-renewable resource and what this industry, what the public needs, and how much of it should be extracted. Because what we're doing is we're giving away our future. And, we can't let the gravel mining industry haul our future away.
Mike, what role does Small Change Fund play in helping communities fight to save valuable farmland from being licensed for quarries and mines? And please let listeners know some of the other invaluable work that Small Change Fund is involved in.
Well, the Small Change Fund is Canada's only crowdfunding site that issues charitable tax receipts. So if you're a grassroots group and you're fighting to defend your community against some development that's going to threaten the environment and put your community's health and safety at risk, Small Change Fund can work with you to establish a project so that donations to your work earn the donors a charitable tax receipt. That's its main objective. Secondarily, we do provide a wide range of communication and campaign supports to local organizations to help them be effective. I'll just give an example. One of the recent projects, very, very effective, was Stop Sprawl Hamilton. And they fought the expansion of the urban boundary that was going to, I forget how many thousands of acres of farmland be designated for development. And that group successfully fought that off. And 2 or 3 times the provincial government tried to override that, and they were stymied every time because of a very powerful grassroots campaign that gave the Hamilton City Council the courage, the political courage and support to resist the Ford government. And those, thousands of acres of farmland have been saved in perpetuity. So that's one example, and there are many examples like that.
Mike, thanks so much for coming in today to talk to us about what's happening around the province with gravel mining and for telling us about the Small Change Fund.
Well, thank you, Doreen. I appreciate your interest and your support.
And thanks to Universe Field for our music, Real Estate, which is available on freemusicarchive.org.